All right, so let's go ahead and get started. And just by way of reminder, the microphones in front of you are live and are on, and maybe we'll get to test them out in this session. I hope so. So I'm going to go ahead and get us rolling with our next session and have our moderator go ahead and introduce everyone. So thank you so much.
All right. Good morning. Good. Good. Good morning. Thank you guys all for coming. My name is Victoria Shanklapore, and I'll be moderating and participating in this roundtable session. Before we begin, I'd like to thank the local arrangements committee and the program committee for their tireless work in organizing our first in-person meeting in 4 long years. At this panel, I hope to have an energetic and thought-provoking discussion about the idea of cyclical themes in history and their impact on us as historians. I'd like to introduce our panelists. Today, in person, we have Michael Cohen, serves as editor and project director for the Correspondence of Zachary Taylor and Millard Fillmore. He is a research professor in American University's Department of Government and a faculty fellow in its Center for Congressional and Presidential Studies. Previously, he was an editor of the Correspondence of James K. Polk and an NHPRC postdoctoral fellow for the papers of Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. He recently edited James K. Polk and his time essays at the conclusion of the Polk Project. He earned a PhD in history at Harvard University and has served the ADE as a counselor at large and on several committees. Also in person, we have Rachel Monroy, began working at the Mary Baker Eddy papers in 2019. Before joining the papers team, she worked as an assistant editor for the papers of the Revolutionary Era, Pinckney Statesman, and a graduate assistant on the papers of Eliza Lucas Pinckney and Harriet Pinckney Hoey. She holds a PhD from the University of South Carolina in early American history. Virtually, we have Candace Folk, the editor and director of the Emma Goldman Papers, a project of the University of California, Berkeley, and of the National Historic Publications Committee of the National Archives. The project is publishing the 4-volume series Emma Goldman, a documentary history of the American years, and has published Emma Goldman, a comprehensive microfilm edition. She's also the author of Love, Anarchy, and Emma Goldman. Falk earned her BA and MA in Humanities at the University of Chicago and her PhD in political theory in the history of conscious program and the University of California, Santa Cruz. I am Victoria Shanklapore. I'm the assistant editor of the Jane Addams Papers Project at Ramapo College of New Jersey. We're currently working on volume 4 of the Selected Papers of Jane Addams, and at the same time as the Jane Addams Digital Edition, a freely accessible online collection of Addams correspondence and writings from 1901 to 1935. So that's us. We're going to have a short introduction period of our projects and what we would like to discuss today. And after that, we will be doing some roundtable questions. And I hope that you guys have some roundtable questions for us that we can have a good discussion about.
Well, can everyone hear me? Okay, I'm seeing nod, so very good.
Turn on the
No, nod as a no.
Bottom. There.
Okay, now you can really hear me?
Mhm.
Okay, thank you for being polite and nodding even when you couldn't. I thank you, Victoria, and thank you all for coming. I'm Michael Cohen. As Victoria said, I work at the Correspondence of Zachary Taylor and Millard Fillmore here at American University. And Zachary Taylor and Millard Fillmore are probably not the first presidents people would think of or historical figures people would think of when they look at connections between the past and the present. They are not often in the news. But through a blog that we've been doing on our project, we actually have been dealing a lot with some parallels and contrasts between the 1840s and 1850s and today. So I'm going to talk a little about that. Before I do that, though, I want to point out that wasn't really intentional. We run a blog at the project, as I said, but every 2 months we publish an article. And the original idea was quite different from what it became. It emerged from sort of two similar ideas. One is the principle of the center where we're based. It's the Center for Congressional and Presidential Studies here at AU. And that center is committed to drawing connections between scholarly research and public education, public engagement. So one purpose of the blog was to be a way for us to share with the public the type of research that we're doing and engage them with the findings that we have in the letters of these two presidents. Another part of it was one of what I consider the central principles of documentary editing, that we should engage with the public on a regular basis, because in documentary editing, what we do is publish original historical literary documents. And that really means every few years we publish a volume or we publish a bunch of letters online. In between, people often don't know what we're doing, what we're up to. So I thought it would be a good idea every couple months to share, well, for now, lately we've been transcribing letters. Lately we've been writing annotations, identifying the people in the letters, or sharing some interesting letters we found, or some interesting findings about what was going on in the 1840s. And we have had a lot of entries that are along the lines of what I just described, like an entry about the history of Thanksgiving or of Christmas celebrations. There was an entry about the process of transcribing letters and the challenges that involves. One of the more interesting ones had to do with our work helping out the TV show Jeopardy, where were doing a clue about Taylor and Fillmore and asked for our assistance in some research. But to my surprise, the current events sort of kept intruding on my intentions. I hadn't expected to see things related to Taylor and Fillmore in the news, but in various direct or indirect ways, they did. The first one was, we officially began this project at the beginning of March 2020. So a couple weeks later, the world shut down. With the COVID pandemic, it immediately brought to mind for me the global cholera pandemic of 1848. That's when Taylor was elected president, Fillmore was elected vice president, and they entered office amid this pandemic. Actually, in Taylor's first and turned out to be only State of the Union address, he addressed this plague, which he described in religious terms, that God had brought upon the country and the world, and then by that time was relaxing. So I wrote an entry about that pandemic and the types of challenges people faced then and how they dealt with it at the government level. Just a couple months later was the tragic death of George Floyd. And related to that, a lot of controversy over monuments to Confederate leaders and other controversial figures, whether we should celebrate them and what types of history we should remember in the public space. Well, we mostly weren't hearing about Taylor and Fillmore, but they were actually part of it. In the state of Washington, a town was considering renaming a Taylor Fillmore Street after Martin Luther King Jr. In Buffalo, Fillmore's hometown, they had a lot of buildings, as well as a statue outside City Hall dedicated to Millard Fillmore. He was the president who had signed the Fugitive Slave Act, which helped to reinforce the institution of slavery and send many more African Americans into a life of servitude. So there were questions, should they continue to honor him? So I wrote a blog entry discussing these issues in the context of the 1840s and 1850s. Then not long after that, the January 6th riot happened. And surprisingly to me, one of the images on the newspapers, on websites about this was Zachary Taylor. One of the many types of damage done by the rioters was to a statue of him in the Capitol. Someone smeared a red substance that looked like blood on the statue. It was very quickly covered up, then brought in for repair. But the Associated Press did get pictures of it, Getty got pictures of it, and those were spread through the media. This reminded me of Zachary Taylor's connection with sort of similar questions that the rioters may have faced, in that before he was president, he considered taking up arms against the US government. He wrote to his nephew, his son-in-law, a man named Jefferson Davis, that maybe if these Northerners become too critical of slavery, we'll need to take up arms against the government and the Union will no longer be worth preserving. Then when he was president, he became very staunchly pro-union and said, supposedly, we haven't confirmed this yet, that he would go down, he was a former general, and just as he'd hanged traitors in Mexico, he would hang the traitors who had taken up arms against the United States, if it ever came to that. Then, I mean, there are other things. I won't go into too much depth for them now. I'm happy to answer questions later. But like when Ukraine was invaded by Russia, that reminded me during the Taylor and Fillmore administrations, Austria and Russia invaded Hungary in an effort to retake that recently independent country. And Taylor and Fillmore had to decide whether the US will become involved in that conflict. There have been continued debates over policing and its impact on African Americans. And that's something that in a very different context, Taylor and Fillmore dealt with. Taylor owned well over 100 human beings and was involved with a US government and police force that existed in large part to protect the institution of slavery, to keep Black people in servitude. And Fillmore, as I mentioned, signed the Fugitive Slave Act, which was an expansion of federal power to use both local authorities and federal ones to keep people in slavery and to send people for the first time, in many cases, into a life of enslavement. Sort of to my surprise, as I said, the current events kept intruding on this, and I kept drawing these connections. As I did so in the blog, I was trying to send two messages. One is what we might think of as the obvious one, those who fail to remember the past, et cetera, that we should understand the past in order to see the context, the larger context for the present, where the current debates and institutions arose from. The other, the one that I've tried to focus on more, though, is the reverse, using the present, what's going on in the news, as kind of an entryway to get people interested in the past, to show that, well, you're interested in what's going on now, watching the news so carefully. Well, some of these same questions in a very different way were being asked and addressed in the 1840s and in the 1850s. Hoping to get people to learn more about that period and to read some of the documents that we're publishing from that time. Thank you.
Should I go next?
Yes, you can go next, Candace.
Okay, well, I just have a very brief summary of the 2 points that I'm going to talk about. One of them has to do with birth control and what's happening now with that movement in contraception and abortion. And the other has to do with pre-World War I and the kind of government acts and laws that were put in place right before the war, the level of suppression, and definitely has a lot in common with the Patriot Act after 9/11. So that's the short version.
That's short. Yeah.
I wish that-
I can go. Can you guys hear me now?
Look closer.
Can you hear me now? Is that better? Scoot up. My name is Rachel Monroy, and I work at the Mary Baker Eddy's papers. And I just wanted to talk about a few of the efforts we've been doing to publicize some of the documents on our collection as they relate to what's been going on in the world. As historical editors, we often prefer to eschew interpretation and let the authors of our documents we edit speak for themselves. Yet the nature of our work, which requires us to carefully read and reread multiple times the correspondence of a specific individual or documents related to a particular event, provides us with a rare in-depth knowledge to offer valuable insight on social and political conversations of our day. I was pleased to be invited to join this roundtable because it's a unique opportunity for documenting editors who too frequently lurk in the background behind our subjects to come forward and speak about important social, cultural, and political topics. While most of us aren't approaching the collections with the intent to find specific documents that may relate to contemporary social issues, Research inherent to the profession of documentary editing demands us to spend countless hours reading letters, diaries, and other textual sources that speak to the issues of our day and provide a much needed historical perspective on current events. At the Mary Baker Eddy Papers, we've encountered a number of letters and documents that offer context, and then in some cases, new information to contribute to the current discussions on racial justice, women's rights, and social welfare. Examining these letters and highlighting them in our publications has allowed us to provide for our readers a trustworthy resource on what Mary Baker Eddy and some of her followers wrote. In an age where misinformation is often too easy to find and scholarly research can be difficult to locate, we hope that in some small way, our efforts help to check the spread of unreliable information on these topics and really remind our audience about the importance of sound historical scholarship. There are a few different methods that we use to bring attention to these specific documents in our collections, and we publish a monthly From the Mary Baker Eddy Papers web-based article series. And this highlights our current work on the papers team, but we also use this to discuss any relevant letters related to current events. We also publicize our findings through the Mary Baker Eddy Library's social media outlets, mainly Facebook and Instagram. And in this way, we sometimes use articles that we previously published and we highlight them again when they're particularly relevant in the news and media. In addition, we send out a quarterly email to our subscribers, and our work is often highlighted in the library's regular podcast series. When the tragic events of 2020 reminded us of the continued need to pursue racial justice in the United States, at the Mary Baker Eddy Library and at the papers team, we considered how the letters we were editing and publishing might have something valuable to say on the topic. Many of our readers were asking and wondering, what did Mary Baker Eddy believe regarding slavery and racism in America, and how did she act on those beliefs? While others were considering how Eddy's followers had responded to racial injustices in the past. We felt it was our responsibility to bring attention to the sources we are aware of within the collections in order to help our audience wrestling with the questions, and also as an effort to provide quality historical scholarship to combat the increased misinformation and fake news circulating in both print and online. We published articles relating to Eddy's view on slavery and emancipation in our From the Papers series, including an analysis of Eddy's exchange of letters with General Benjamin F. Butler, the commander at Fort Monroe in Virginia. And Eddy had written Butler on August 17, 1861, and having read a letter that Butler wrote that was later published on August 6th in the New York Times. And the exchange related to the events that occurred in May of that year when 3 enslaved men who had been made to construct a Confederate fort across the James River from Fort Monroe actually escaped to the Union fort and received protection from Butler under the assertion that enslaved workers could be claimed as contraband property and seized by the United States. And so in her correspondence with Butler and his aides, Eddy expressed her support for what she saw as granting the rights of all humanity to humanity to Black as well as white men, women, and children. And Eddy later drafted a petition, and she collected signatures from other women who were also in support of emancipation. Another article in that series highlighted Eddy's support of John C. Fremont's attempt to emancipate enslaved workers or enslaved people under martial law in Missouri. And as news spread throughout the Union Army of Butler's successful efforts at Fort Monroe, Eddy closely followed the ramifications of what happened in the newspapers and other publications. And when General John C. Fremont, commander of the Union Army of the West, acted in response to Butler's success, Eddy wrote a poem describing him as one of what she called the fearless and the free. And she reflected on his efforts and proclaimed her continued interest in the cause of emancipation. And then Fremont issued a proclamation on August 30th, 1861, that instituted martial law in the state of Missouri, which included the confiscation of Confederate property and the freeing of enslaved men and women owned by rebel Missourians. However, Fremont's attempt to weaken the Confederacy through targeting slavery wasn't successful. And when Eddy learned that Lincoln had countermanded General Fremont's order for emancipation, she expressed her disappointment through poetry. So she went and wrote about it. And in December of 1861, she penned a poem in praise of Fremont's efforts and really reflected on his actions and his consequences and painted them as heroic despite their immediate failures. Beyond this, our collections have also given us the opportunity to discuss lesser known Black men and women in history whose trajectories have intersected with the life of Mary Baker Eddy. One example was an article we wrote about Daniel A.P. Murray, who is the assistant librarian at the Library of Congress and one of the first African Americans to work for the institution. Along with his work at the Library of Congress, Murray was active in prominent African American social circles in Washington, D.C., and he testified before Congress on Jim Crow laws, and also twice served as a delegate on the Republican National Convention. And his activism was intertwined with the unparalleled contributions he made to collecting African American writing and other creative works. And so we were able to highlight this through because of the exchanges that Mary Baker Eddy had with him regarding her publications. Not only has our research on Eddy's views regarding racism and slavery allowed us to publish both new and relevant research on the topic, but it's also reminded us that the paper's team of Eddy's own convictions to act in support of the causes with which she agreed, thus strengthening our own resolve to do the same through research and documentary editing. We've been reminded through her correspondence with Butler, organization of petitions in support of emancipation, and social and political commentary through poetry, and how she responded to pressing issues in 19th century America, using the resources available to her and the talents that she had. And so similarly at the papers team, we hope to use the tools available to our trade to share our knowledge with the public. Beyond the series on slavery and racism that we did, we also found that in the Eddy papers, a number of letters that discuss the topic of reform in the 19th century and relate to current conversations on social welfare and debates on the need for a living wage. One article we published online in 2020 highlighted the work of R.A. Rowley, who is an integral part of the Canal Street Mission in Buffalo, New York, which was a shelter for women looking to escape prostitution. Also, Rowley started the Working Women's Home in Buffalo, which offered furnished rooms and meals for women who are in low-wage jobs and couldn't afford these things. And so Rowley's work demonstrates how one of Eddy's followers responded to the crisis facing women in the 19th century workforce and provides a historical perspective on the continuing struggle for workers and the need for relief organizations today. And then one of the most relevant current topics widely discussed in the Eddy papers is that of gender equality and women's rights. Eddy's pioneering role as a female religious leader in 19th century America and her encouragement of other women to take leadership roles within Christian Science provides much source material on the topic within letters and documents in our collections. And we've highlighted many of these women in our publications, and we've discussed the challenges that they face both as religious leaders and in the larger world. One article we published in 2022 specifically examined more than a dozen female physicians who wrote to Mary Baker Eddy, and we really looked at their achievements despite the odds that they faced during that time, and gave our readers historical context on the struggle for women's equality, and both professionally and within the religious community, and provided further perspective on the state of the ongoing fight to achieve equality for women. So overall, at the Mary Baker Eddy papers, we found that while not overtly seeking to speak to the current social and political climate, our work naturally provides much useful historical perspective on topics circulating in social media and in the news. Our response has been to feature any particular relevant documents within our collection using our From the Papers article series, quarterly email newsletter, social media outlets, and podcasts. As documentary editors, we value sound historical scholarship based on the sources and see these publication avenues as merely an extension of the work we're already doing every day. Our community of historical editors widely recognizes the responsibility we hold to provide access to the letters, diaries, manuscripts, and other documents we edit, but perhaps that responsibility also extends to using our unique bodies of knowledge to bring attention to our collections that speak to the issues of the day. And as caretakers of that knowledge, make available reliable, sound research scholarship to a general public desperately seeking information.
Okay. So the quickest rundown of Jane Addams ever. She was born in 1860, died in 1935. She was a progressive era activist, leader, public speaker, author, social worker. She brazenly fought for child laborers, women's suffrage, and increased educational opportunities. immigrant rights, charity reform, police brutality, and racism. And what she may claim was her most important work, world peace. I got this group together. I was inspired by Michael's blog about Zachary Taylor and the Fillmore Papers. We also have a blog. It's not so much, there's many different topics, but what I really resonated with the one of the blog posts I wrote was looking at the similarities between police brutality. This was, back in 2016, in Jane Addams' time and today. And that's kind of also what set me on this path into realizing this cyclical nature of historical patterns. At the Jane Addams Papers, we employ undergraduate students to transcribe documents and research individuals, organizations, and events that appear in her correspondence and published work. Our students are sharp and curious. Many of them note the similarities between some of the topics I previously mentioned and current events. It is sometimes difficult to explain to them how to process the realizations that problems so close to their lives are not necessarily new, that people for the last 100 years or more have been struggling with similar or the same problems. Once they understand this idea, it's easier for them to see past patterns and hopefully more clearly build a timeline of how ideas of the past continue to influence humanity for hundreds of years past their inception. The ideas of the progressive era that Jane Addams so strongly opposes began long before, and seeing this pattern provides context for them. It's my hope that during this discussion, we can use this understanding of historical patterns to our advantage as pseudo storytellers. So I'm going to get us started with pre-formed discussion questions. And I hope that you will also ask your own. I know that you, Michael and Rachel, both have blogs and sufficient various ways of disseminating your ideas. What would you say is the most effective way that you've found to kind of get these ideas out there to the public?
Well, I do find that the blog is effective in that it's especially effective when we can tie a story, something about letters that we've been working with from the 19th century, with something very specific to today. And that doesn't necessarily mean a story in the news. As I said, we've had blog entries like about the history of Thanksgiving and about the history of Christmas celebrations, which were very different and much less common and central to culture in the mid-19th century than they are today. Like I wrote a blog about summer travel and the 4th of July in the summer one year, because, well, that's what people are thinking about. And when I try to share news about the blog and about our project, we do that through a Twitter account, ZTNMF, and I send it out through various listservs and other ways that scholars will look for information about what their colleagues are doing. We've also been very fortunate in making connections with people who can share this with a wider public. And as I said, Jeopardy had once contacted us kind of out of the blue. We're doing this clue. We're a category about Millard Fillmore, of all things. Even the host kind of laughed about how exciting that is when it was on the show. I mean, they even thanked our project on the air. So people found out about us. And I think that probably attracted a few people to our website, taylorandfillmore.org, which is where the blog is. I mean, once one of the blog entries became an op-ed in a newspaper around President's Day. And it's effective to let people know what we're doing and more generally what documentary editors do and the importance of studying original primary sources in order to understand the past. It's effective if we can tie that something that's already on people's minds, which, as I said earlier, very often is, though not always, something in the news about the history of race or medicine or all the other issues we've been dealing with.
I think that we found in our project that our different publication avenues reach different audiences. The quarterly email we send out really reaches the people that are already invested in our project and they're already interested, and they might share with others because they're excited about what they read. And then the podcast reaches those who are interested in the larger work that the library is doing and might not be as specifically interested in the papers or just might not know what's going on. And then I think we reach the most new people through social media and through sharing our articles on Facebook and Instagram in hopes that others would share them. And sometimes, like, we just had a recent article that we published on Mary Baker Eddy's involvement with the Church of Christian Science's involvement with the Chautauqua movement. And we were excited to see that others who are involved with the Chautauqua movement kind of came in and shared it to their group. And so that's the kind of stuff that we hope to see. And we hope that things like Instagram and Facebook allow people to do that.
I'm wondering whether I can come in at this point.
Of course.
Because I don't think I read your directions right, because I thought we were only supposed to talk 5 minutes. So that's why I gave a very short intro about what I was thinking about writing about. So I guess to say quickly, 150 years ago, Congress passed and President Grant signed into law the Comstock Act to a moment in which I'll explain the Comstock Act. First, what the key elements of the Comstock Act were prohibition of using the US Postal Service to distribute pornography and other obscene material, which was defined to include any material related to abortion and contraception. 2, the Comstock Act prohibited use of the US Post Office to contribute items that promoted or were used for abortion or contraception. So all of this must sound very familiar to those of you who have been following the news lately. And Anthony Comstock was an unpaid special postal agent who had the power to enforce the law and to just, to decide what was objectionable material. And he used his power and to bestow upon the state of New York to make thousands of arrests, confiscate tons of books and pictures, and bar many periodicals from the mail. And one of Comstock's targets was Margaret Sanger, who, together with my subject, Emma Goldman, was a prominent advocate of birth control in the early 20th century. In 1914, Margaret Sanger was indicted under the Comstock Act for distributing a newsletter that contained information on birth control. Sanger fled the country to avoid prosecution. The charges against her were eventually dropped in 1950, but her husband was prosecuted and sentenced for 30 days in jail just for distributing birth control pamphlets. So for a really long time, the Comstock Act was kind of dormant, and especially with respect to abortion, drugs, and such things. One second. In 1973 to 2022, the Supreme Court's Roe versus Wade decision held that there was a constitutional right to abortion subject to some restrictions. But in 2022, Dobbs' decision, the Supreme Court reversed that decision. So essentially, it's been 150 years since the passage of the Comstock Act. And it's quite amazing how that is being used now with such vigilance. And one second. Trump appointed the U.S. District Court judge in Texas, Matthew Karam. Anyway, invoked in the current situation. There's a Trump assigned judge from Texas who is making legal theories to rule that medical abortion drugs, mifepristone, should be banned nationwide. So this, in sum, is the relationship between then and now. And I can, of course, like all of you, go on and on. Our project gives a very clear understanding of how this is all related. And in many ways, ours is, it's more obvious. The other issue that I wanted to discuss was what happens before a major event in history happens. So right before the US entered World War I, there was a rash of legal acts that were passed to make sure that in a country that had said that they were not biased and they were going to stay out of war, essentially passed the Alien Immigration Act in 1917, the Anarchist Immigration Law in 1918, and which authorized deportations and general radicalism. And the other thing is that the Bolshevik advances fostered other prejudices like German prominence and immigration mood of the country and the National Amnesty League. So, saying it briefly, there was a deportation of Emma Goldman in 1919. And J. Edgar Hoover, who was only 25 years old at the time, was using this as an intimidation tactic. And he said, Emma Goldman and Alexander Berkman, beyond a doubt, are two of the most dangerous anarchists in this country, and if permitted to return to the community, will result in undue harm. Another person of his level said, she's doing tremendous damage. She is remarkable and tremendously sincere and carries conviction. If she continues here, she cannot help but to have great influence. So I should just say that what Emma Goldman was great at was articulating social issues. And many people thought that she was actually 8,000 years ahead of her age. So really, they said that. So moving right along, after 9/11, as you may remember, the Patriot Act was signed into law just within 6 weeks after the attack. It set off racial reactions, prejudice, suppression practices, immigration policies, and similar to World War I, detention of immigrants, the Espionage Act, sedition, and the expanded use of terrorism crimes. So it was to have better instruments to intercept such acts like 9/11. So briefly, those are the two issues that are so obviously then and now similar in ways that are actually quite terrible. That's that.
Thank you so much, Candace. Oh, yes, Connie.
I would like Candace to address your question, which was in view of the
No.
issue of modalities. She has some interesting modalities, if you will, or methods of bringing hemoglobin. And I mean, I still have my coffee cup, but you
Yeah.
documentary editing by outreach to people who may not normally follow the hemoglobin papers. And that was the question that was asked, that I thought, gee, she could really jump in on that.
Yeah. Well, I should say that the hemoglobin papers is now almost at the end, where we're publishing the very last of 4 volumes of her selected works. And we published 22,000 letters of Emma's. And so we have done so much, but the beginning was to highlight the fact that so many people think that they know everything that Emma Goldman said or did, and they don't. And so we try to do things that are fun, really. So our mugs, for example, have a mugshot photo of Emma Goldman on the mug. And in the spirit of people put their coffee in that, a quote that says, sooner or later, the American people are going to wake up. And that's, so that's been really fun to do. And it's amazing how many people want that, need it, where it turns up. It's wonderful. And, you know, that's just one of many things that we've done over the years. I could go into others, but that's the most dramatic.
I'm sure the program committee didn't think of coffee mugs as part of modality.
What's that?
Thank
Didn't hear
you.
you.
We'll have to talk about disseminating some of those mugs, Candace. Okay. Yep.
So my question is for everyone. I think you all talked about some of the ways that your projects take advantage of present moments that are really productive and really address key issues for your audiences. But I guess I'm wondering, have you noticed any dangers or any kind of maybe ways that key moments can be misinterpreted in light of what was happening in the historical record, and then how that can in turn be misinterpreted by an audience maybe that you didn't suspect, or used in a way that in messaging that doesn't exactly align with what your supporter would have said or thought. Sorry, your historical subject would have said or thought. So just wondered if you could talk about maybe some of the moments where it wasn't necessarily a positive, or maybe didn't work out in the ways that you had thought it might.
Oh, well, if I can begin. One, I think it's very important that we emphasize not just similarities, but also contrast with the past, and that though there are these similar questions people are exploring, they happen in very different contexts. Like, I mentioned that we had written a blog entry about that related to the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the Austrian and Russian invasion of Hungary back in the 19th century. Besides the blog, I had given a talk about that once at a university. And afterwards, a student asked me, in light of Taylor's and Fillmore's responses to that effort, if that can provide guidance for how the United States should respond to the situation in Ukraine today. And as I told the student, it happened in such a different context in terms of the United States' role in the world that it's very hard to draw those connections, which is not to say that people can't learn from the past, but we want to be very cautious of making a simple one-to-one comparison relationship between something that happened with such different questions, different abilities by the US military, different relationships between the United States and the countries concerned. And very different situation when you get down to the specifics in terms of the Eastern European invasion context. I think it's important to draw those distinctions as well. In terms of the other part of your question about things being used or interpreted in ways that we didn't intend, we haven't encountered that a lot in my specific project with Taylor and Fillmore, though one danger of dealing with what's in the news is that the news changes. I mean, when we're talking about something that happened 170 years ago, well, still there are new interpretations, new evidence, and we keep understanding things in ways that we didn't before. Well, if I'm discussing something in my blog that was on the news this morning, well, then next week, there may be another report that, oh, actually, this was a little different. And that happened with the January 6th riot. In that case, initially investigators were reporting and the news were announcing, and the news was reporting that a police officer had been murdered that day. And later they changed that interpretation. The medical examiner said that that the person died of natural causes, though related to injuries that he'd suffered that day. So in an earlier version of the blog, I had used the language that the government investigators were using at the time. And later, after I wasn't thinking about that particular blog entry, a reader emailed to me saying, actually, this isn't what happened. This isn't how they're describing it now. So I updated the blog to reflect the official the investigator's official conclusion with links to the sources of that and what we'd used before, noting how we changed that to address the new information, the new interpretations.
You know, I just want to say that I have a very dramatic contrast between then and now. I purposely chose for today abortion because there are two sides to the issue, and also the Patriot Act and what happened before World War I. And I guess just by itself, there were already two sides and a very, very strong bit of the public who believed in one or the other. So, and many people thought that Emma Goldman was violent, although she understood it, she actually wasn't. But that's the kind of thing you got to get in trouble with. And I thought it was really wonderful to be able to give both sides a platform. But University of California, Berkeley decided that it was too risky to keep us on the campus because they get state money. So that's their interpretation ended up being the one that kicked us out. We're still working, but it was horribly dramatic. That's all I have to say.
I'll jump in with that. It's honestly a similar answer to Michael's, but I think that a lot of my interaction with these ideas comes directly from students. And Jane Addams was a liberal thinker of her time. Many of our students find her stances on these issues to be rather lukewarm. I do try to emphasize the slow to change nature of public opinion on these systematic issues. But I also try to have them understand the stark differences from this 100-year gap. I think also, as you said, it's easier to make connections on a one-on-one basis than on a like a large more than one-on-one basis. It's important to understand that contextual background from then and into now. And I hope that whenever I or my colleagues talk about these issues, that we are making apparent that there are reasons that our subjects felt the way they did, And there are reasons that people might not have agreed with them. And that's important, I think, for understanding those same things today. Why do we believe the things we believe today? And maybe why don't other people agree with us?
I'd like to just add, kind of building on what Michael said. I think one of the challenges that we face is that the news does change and it changes quickly. And we're trying to provide good scholarly research. And so what we're doing sometimes takes longer than we have. And so what happens sometimes for us is that an issue might have passed in the news or changed before we're able to release something on it. And as a result, I think maybe the struggle we have is not being able to be as responsive as we want to, and we kind of take the path away of dealing with more like overarching issues that can be relevant for like a longer time and less like day-to-day current events.
Yes.
Thank you. Katie Sibley from St. Joe's. I'll try to talk loud, but not too loud. My question is, I was really interested, Rachel, in what you were saying about Mary Baker Eddy's connection with women. I didn't know much about that her sympathies there. And then you mentioned physicians, women physicians. And then of course that begged the question for me about her, you know, as a Christian Scientist, maybe this is the simplistic interpretation, but that she, I would have imagined, didn't really believe so much maybe in some of the things these women practice, which then led me to the thought of the COVID pandemic. And, you know, that would be sort of an interesting connection. I don't know if it's relevant, but, you know, so many people refusing vaccines and then her issues about, you know, bodies curing themselves. So I wondered if that had ever come up in your discussions.
That's a great question. I think we did publish a few articles on healing in general during that time. We didn't necessarily like it was, everyone was thinking about the COVID pandemic. So I don't know that it was necessarily for us to say this is a specific reaction, but with regard to the women doctors, I think that many times people came to her and they saw it as like another way, another pathway towards curing people and healing people. And she was kind of like glad to have them be interested in her work. And so, and that's kind of the conversation started. And so we were excited to see that a number of these women who were highly educated and physicians reached out to her. And just another thing that we found really interesting is the female leadership within that she encouraged of women that were that moved to, she asked to move to different cities and to start these institutes. And so that's been something that's been really interesting for us to highlight with regard to women's history as well. Yes.
When I listen to this conversation, what comes to mind, first of all, I want to say to Michael, the way to understand Hungary would be through the path of Eastern Europe, which about 1.0001% of Americans understand. Eastern Europe being so complicated, there is no way in which that comparison could have been made, or Americans understand what Eastern Europe even was. And I'm struck by that more and more almost every day, and which highlights, I think, even further this problem of context. That is not just the American context. In this case, it's the European context. It's not just the European context. It's the Eastern European context, which is underwritten about scholars, and the scholarship on it is not popular scholarship. But most of all, as I listen to this, it seems to me that I'm sitting in a room where people have done utterly brilliant work. That the additions that people here have put out, the amount of work that's gone in, the effort to get everything right has been astounding. And yet here we are in a world in 2023 in which history departments are being diminished. The humanities are themselves being diminished. We're not STEM, and therefore we don't get that kind of financial support. And we feel at the same time, we have nothing really to say. And I think must be frustrating is who's listening. So we go into things like blogs and so on and so forth, who's listening. But I wonder if maybe there's a more of a top-down kind of way to do this. I don't know whether the ADE works as an organization with educators. Because how do we get the stuff that we do, the stuff that's so profoundly good, into high school classrooms? They do still teach American history. They don't teach European history much, but they do still teach American history. How do we get to, we assume that university level professors know about us, but I'm not even sure that's true. How do we do that? And how do we produce, as I say, these brilliant works that can be accessed, which could be used by good high school students, bad high school students, but they need, popular writers, university students, they all need context, but most of all, they need attention. And I think sort of from the bottom down, who's listening to my podcast or who's reading my letter to the editor in the Washington Post. That's not to say that there aren't 10,000 people reading that letter to the Washington Post, but I'm not sure we have a bigger problem in front of us. And so I wonder whether we ought to be thinking about how we get other institutions, how the ADE itself links to other educational institutions or pieces of them. And I don't even know what to say about popular presses, obviously university press too, to make this work, to shine a light on this work, which is so fabulous and so important.
I want to say that at least the Emma Goldman papers, we have done several high school and middle school curricula and gone to the there are meetings of secondary school teachers who love the material, even though they sometimes have a hard time getting it through their board, but they love the material because we separate out the quotes and the context and the kind of questions that work with our material. And that, after doing that, I thought everybody should do that, except that we're all so busy. But that really helps.
I also, that's one of our, at the Jane Addams papers, that's something we have realized that honestly, a lot of people they do want this way to teach more specific history in their mostly high school courses. We've gone out of our way to create guides for them. We utilize the students who are in our teaching portion of our college to write mostly AP history guides, but we have written things. I don't know if anyone participates in National History Day. We have a lot of guides on the themes of National History Day, and those are honestly the most visited sites on our websites consistently. And I know that it is not one of our primary focuses as editors, but I do think that if you can find someone to work with, because I don't know how to write an AP history plan, and I neither do any of our editors, but if you have the ability to find someone that can work with you on that, I think it's extremely important. And I think that you would be surprised to find out how many people are looking for a resource like that.
If I can echo some of what you're saying, Victoria, we have, in addition to the other things on our website, we have produced a teaching guide. It was about Texas annexation, based around some of the documents, letters to and from Fillmore that we'd worked on. And that has been an extremely popular part of the site, often viewed. And I know the ADE, through its educational resources site, has shared that. The National Archivist shared it on social media. And a big goal of the blog and our outreach in general is to let people know what we're doing, but not to stop there, hoping that some of these people who can use them will move on to look at the documents that we've edited and published. So I try to include documents or portions of them in as many of those entries as I can. And although I'm not part of it, so I'm not the best person to speak about it, I know that the Association for Documentary Editing has been really trying to step up its efforts in educational outreach. And the Education Committee, as well as the University of Virginia's e-laboratory system, have been trying to really expand educational resources and information they offer both to documentary editors themselves and more broadly to teachers and students.
I was just going to, I'm new to ADE and I'm a little confused as to what our mission is. We are documentary editors. We deal with context. We become subject matter experts. But are we journalists? Do we create a speakers bureau as we are the subject matter experts on this, and through our vehicles that we're using to reach the mission of each individual project, do we say to the organization, what is it the mission of the organization to help perpetuate what the members are doing and develop a relationship with other organizations like the National Council for the Social Studies, or to even use the Common Core specification for K through 12? How, as an organization, what are we? Are we, you as a subject matter expert on the presidential papers, do you come into the law school and say, hey, this happened then in the 1700s, 1800s, let's bring it into current times? Do we impact the law? Do we start advocating for change? Or, I mean, where do we go? We have such wealth in this room, such amazing subject matters. No one knows. I'm telling you honestly, no one really knows what we're doing. So relationship building is very important. The National Council for the Social Studies would jump at a relationship with you, the ADE, as an organization, as a pipeline to put historical context on what our kids need to learn. So I'm still learning and I'm grasping, trying to understand what is our role here. Your
If I could
role,
go outside the
updating your
panel.
blog on a regular basis as a journalist, as a citizen journalist, as a historian, or as a scholar. I mean, do we have those defined lines, or are there gray areas? So I'm just speaking out loud because I'm listening to all these different statements about your incredible projects and how it relates to the world and the bigger picture. But what does this organization do to help us bring all of this insight to the larger world?
Well, I just want to say thank you so much for that wonderful circulation of ideas. And so I'm Serenity Sutherland, for everyone on Zoom who might not know. And I'm going to soon be the president of the organization, so I feel compelled to answer this question. So I think that there's more that can be said here, but I did want to direct people to the purpose statement that we have as part of our Constitution on ADE's website. And I'm just going to read certain sections of it because I think it's really important to answering this question. And there could certainly be more conversation about what our purpose is, but we have now that our purpose is to support, facilitate, and promote the creation and use of edited texts and other acts of recovery through cooperation and exchange. We also say that our primary source material consists of texts, cultural artifacts, that we're trying to reach editors, teachers, students, interdisciplinary scholars, librarians, archivists, genealogists, and others. So, I mean, to think about that, I mean, we do have all this great expertise, and to think about who our audience is summed up pretty well in the purpose statement. But I think how to do that is kind of the question that we're talking
Here's
about
a
here.
really simple one. On our membership list, if we put the URL of each member's subject, then we as members can look at each other's stuff and help promote it, and
Yeah,
even do some cross-referencing.
That's a great idea to also direct people to the e-laboratories website, which Michael mentioned, which does things like that as well. So I just wanted to jump in and say, I think this is a great conversation, direct people to the website. And if you're really interested in solving these problems and answering these questions, please see me, because I have many committees that you could be on and which we could do this work together. So thank you.
You know, for years, I've been hoping that our every time we have a conference, that we have people from other organizations there, so that everyone there can know, like you can work on Emma Goldman or Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and someone who's a more straight historian can give a paper on that. Someone who works with students can give a paper on that, just so that we have some integration of our work in public. What do you think?
Also, just reflecting on what Samantha Chang said a minute ago, I think it is important, to draw these connections and to remember what we are and what we aren't. I mean, I would say freely, I am not a journalist. I am not a high school educator. I have great respect for the people who do that, and I am nowhere near as versed in that as they are. I was kind of reminded of this when we were working on our teaching guide. At the time, we had an editorial assistant who was a teacher and a graduate student in education. And as we were doing this, she brought up the question of the standards that the particular states use and how we should incorporate that into this, which were issues that I had not given much thought to be honest. So we, I mean, it is important for us to draw those connections and work with, as you said, other organizations and individuals.
I think that it's important sometimes to distinguish between being the editor of a project about an activist and becoming an activist. As someone who worked for a really long time with the Margaret Sanger papers, we could not spend our time debunking the theories that were out there, which were much less easy for them to get to us in the 80s and 90s than they were later. But you're defending the documents in some way, but you're trying not to necessarily, answer all questions about a topic and explore all its relevant things. And I think it's really difficult sometimes to try to keep yourself in the lane of, I'm the editor of this project, I'm not the defender of all reproductive rights, which is what you feel like doing sometimes. But I think, for editors, it's really hard sometimes to figure out what exactly is the core part of the project. And I do think it comes down to things like, what is what does my grant say I'm doing? When we did the AP project, that's a separate grant, that we're actually not even really on. We just advise the people who are doing it. But, trying to figure out how to get your job done as an editor, but also to make the documents more accessible is the goal. But it's, it can be a really slippery slope if you have a project that's controversial. All I want to say.
I think all of our subject matters are controversial, which is why we're doing what we're doing.
Do we have anyone else?
Candace, I wish you were here in person.
I wish I was there in person. I am one of the few people who love conferences. So you can actually see who you're working with and talk at more extensively on the side. I'm really sorry. The problem is, not only do I live in California and it's hard to get there, but sad to say, I was run over by a SUV and I can't really walk very well. So
My God.
it's horrible. It's horrible. So, you can't believe that your life could change that quickly. So I'm so grateful for Zoom, but I'm really tired of being home. That's all.
Well, we wish you were here.
Get better.
Get better.
Thank you. I
Yes,
hope
we are
so.
all sending you well wishes and thinking of you. So thank you so much for joining us via Zoom. And so we're going to cut the time in half. I said we'd get done at 11:20, but if there's no more questions, we'll end 11:17. All right, so none in Zoom. Okay, great. So we'll send everyone off to lunch, which is of course one of the best parts of the day. So we will be coming back here for our plenary. So please join us after lunch back here in this room. Thank you for such a great roundtable that produced such a great conversation and session. I really look forward to having more talks with you all. See you soon back in the afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you.